Hey everyone! You can put your phone down now, maybe dim the screen a little. This isn't the kind of history you have to stay wide awake for. Tonight, we're drifting back to a quieter world, one filled with smoke, candlelight, and the soft but constant creak of wooden beams. A world before street lamps, before alarm clocks, and long before the phrase, sleep hygiene, meant anything at all. We're going to wander through the strange, occasionally disgusting, and often unintentionally hilarious sleeping habits of medieval people. So, settle in, find your most comfortable position, and let your mind drift to a time when even going to bed was an adventure. If you were alive in, say, the year 1350, bedtime wasn't something to look forward to. It was a necessity, like paying taxes or not dying of dysentery. Bedrooms were more like functional spaces than cozy sanctuaries. Most people didn't even have a bedroom. They had a multipurpose room, with one area for eating, another for working, and one small corner where you curled up when it got too dark to see. There was no concept of privacy, no Netflix to unwind with, and if you were lucky, your bed didn't crawl away in the night. The poor, which was most of the population, slept on straw. Just straw. Sometimes laid over a cloth sack, sometimes just loose on the floor. The word mattress comes from the Arabic matra, meaning place where something is thrown down. And that's really what it was, a pile of organic material you hoped wouldn't rot too quickly. Some peasants mixed their straw with dried herbs like lavender or mint, not for relaxation, but to cover the smell of mildew and livestock. It didn't work. Everything still smelled faintly like barnyard soup. If you were slightly better off, you might have a wooden frame to elevate your straw mattress. That was considered luxury because it kept you away from the dirt and the cold air that seeped up from the floorboards. Rats and fleas, however, did not respect social boundaries. They climbed. Many households kept cats specifically to reduce nighttime squeaking, though cats in medieval times were more semi-employed freeloaders than pets. They showed up, ate a mouse, and disappeared again. People didn't name them. They barely acknowledged them. But they were there, silently judging your bedding situation. For nobles, of course, sleeping arrangements were a statement of wealth. A medieval lord might sleep in a massive four-poster bed draped with curtains of wool or linen, embroidered with a family crest, and layered with multiple mattresses, feather quilts, and silken sheets. You might think, at least the rich had comfort. But no. The feather beds were so stuffed that they sloped awkwardly, and the pillows were more like bags of dense fluff designed to prop up your head at a noble angle rather than cradle your neck. Imagine trying to rest while maintaining the posture of a taxidermied swan. That was luxury. And even if the bed was comfortable, the room was not. Castles were cold, drafty, and smelled perpetually of smoke, damp stone, and sometimes chamber pots. The grand curtains around the bed weren't for romance, they were for insulation. Sleeping enclosed in heavy fabric was the only way to trap warmth. It also, incidentally, trapped odors. You can imagine the aroma by combining wet wool, candle wax, and a hint of centuries-old dust. But before anyone could settle into that stiff bedding, they had to perform the nightly rituals, not skincare routines or cozy chamomile tea, but the simple act of surviving the dark. Because in the medieval world, night was dangerous. Without modern lighting, the world outside your door vanished into blackness. People genuinely feared the dark, not metaphorically, but viscerally. It was when thieves moved, when wolves prowled, and when demons were said to whisper through cracks in the walls. Many homes had charms nailed above the door, sprigs of herbs, bits of iron, little crosses, not for decoration, but as supernatural burglar alarms. Inside, light came from the fire, which burned low after supper, or from a single candle. Candles were expensive. Most people used tallow candles made from animal fat, and they stank. Beeswax candles, the kind that smelled faintly of honey, were reserved for churches and the elite. The glow of tallow light was dim and greasy, more depressing than comforting. But people used it anyway, reading prayers or mending clothes until they grew too sleepy to care. Now, if you're wondering about pajamas, they didn't exist. The rich had nightshirts, long linen garments that looked like oversized tunics. The poor simply slept in their clothes. Getting undressed was impractical in cold climates and a bit scandalous. If you shared the room with others. And everyone shared rooms. Even nobles weren't alone. Servants slept on pallets near the master's bed, ready to fetch water, stoke fires, or, on very unlucky nights, empty the chamber pot. Privacy, as a concept, was centuries away from invention. Here's something most people today don't realize. Medieval people didn't sleep all the way through the night. They practiced what historians call segmented sleep or biphasic sleep. You'd go to bed soon after sunset, sleep for 4 or 5 hours, called the first sleep, then wake around midnight. This wasn't insomnia, it was the natural rhythm of pre-industrial life. During the midnight hours, people prayed, talked quietly, or sometimes even went visiting neighbors. Some wrote letters, some tended to livestock, and yes, some enjoyed what records delicately call marital duties. After that, they returned for a second sleep until dawn. It's oddly poetic, this rhythm of rest and wakefulness, 2 halves of the night punctuated by a peaceful pause. The invention of artificial lighting eventually erased it, but back then, it was just how humans functioned. Dreams held enormous meaning too. They weren't random nonsense from the subconscious, they were thought to be messages, divine or diabolical. Priests, physicians, and mystics all tried to interpret them. If you dreamed of water, they said, you were melancholic. If you dreamed of fire, you were choleric. Flying dreams could mean you were close to God, or close to losing your mind. People even kept dream manuals that explained the hidden meanings of symbols. Dream of a white horse. Good fortune. Dream of a goat. Bad omen. Dream of the Virgin Mary handing you bread? Excellent news for your eternal soul. And nightmares, or night terrors, were blamed on a creature called the mare, a demonic entity that pressed down on your chest while you slept. It's where the word nightmare comes from. Today, we'd call it sleep paralysis, but to them, it was a spirit visiting in the night. To ward it off, some slept with knives under their pillows, or with iron keys, since demons supposedly hated metal. Others recited protective prayers before bed. Of course, none of it worked, but it gave people something to do while lying awake at 2 a.m., which is still relatable. We also have accounts of people sleep-talking or wandering in the night, which the medieval mind interpreted as spiritual affliction. Sleepwalking was blamed on witches. Somniloquy, talking in your sleep, could be used as evidence in court, especially if you said something incriminating. There's a record of a man in 1323 who mumbled something about stealing grain while half asleep. His neighbor overheard and reported him. He was fined. So yes, in the Middle Ages, even your dreams could betray you. Speaking of betrayal, beds were often communal not out of love, but necessity. Heat was shared like gossip. Entire families slept together, sometimes with guests squeezed in, sometimes even with servants or travelers. There are documented instances of inns renting a space in a bed, rather than a whole room. It wasn't uncommon to wake up beside a stranger and just shrug it off. One English innkeeper proudly advertised, clean sheets weekly, which, for the record, was considered exceptional hygiene. Noble households had more structure. A lord might share his bed with his spouse, but children, attendants, and sometimes visiting dignitaries would sleep nearby, within the same chamber. Henry VIII, for example, had a groom of the stool. Yes, that was an actual job title, whose duties included sleeping near the king to attend to his, let's say, nocturnal needs. Imagine being paid to spend your nights next to a snoring monarch and a royal commode. Medieval employment wasn't for the faint of heart. As we drift deeper into the night, let's think about what comfort meant back then. There were no duvets, no down pillows, no soft cotton sheets. Blankets were coarse wool, itchy and heavy. The fire crackled faintly, offering the only real warmth. Outside, wind rattled shutters. Inside, you might hear the snort of a pig from the adjoining stable. Yet somehow they slept. Maybe exhaustion helped. Manual labor from sunrise to sunset has a way of ensuring unconsciousness, even on a bed of straw. And still, amid all the grime and superstition, there was something almost peaceful about medieval sleep. The rhythm of night and day wasn't dictated by clocks or deadlines. People went to bed because darkness told them to. They woke because the light returned. No alarms, no blue light warnings, no guilt about morning routines. Just a natural surrender to the passage of time. So, as you lie here, maybe think about that, what it might feel like to rest in a world without electricity, in a bed that creaks like a living thing, under a sky black enough to swallow every thought. Would you find it calming? Or would the silence drive you mad? Tell me what you think, in the comments, perhaps, if you're still awake by the end of this. And with that, let's drift onward, into the second part of our sleepy little journey, where we'll explore how medieval people handled the less pleasant parts of nighttime, their hygiene, chamber pots, and those strange remedies they swore by for better rest. Hey everyone! If you're still with me, you've survived your first night in the medieval world. Congratulations! You probably smell faintly of wood smoke and tallow, and you've just shared your straw mattress with 2 family members and a goat. But don't worry, tonight's story drifts gently into something even stranger. How people in the Middle Ages tried to stay clean, relieve themselves, and, somehow, prepare for rest again. Spoiler alert, clean meant something very different back then. Let's start with a universal bedtime problem, needing to use the bathroom. There were no toilets, of course. There were chamber pots. Beautiful, hideous, or purely functional, these were the silent companions of every medieval night. You'd keep one under the bed or in a corner, sometimes even behind a curtain if you were fancy. For the poor, it was a clay pot or wooden bucket. For the rich, it might be brass, pewter, or even silver, because naturally, if you're going to relieve yourself in the middle of the night, it should be in style. Now, where did it all go afterward? Well, it depended on your social standing and geography. In rural homes, people emptied the chamber pot outside, often right next to where the animals lived. In cities, however, the solution was far more democratic. You simply tossed it out the window. Yes, really. A quick shout of "Gardez-le!" A polite warning borrowed from the French "Gardez-l'eau," meaning watch out for the water, and down it went, sometimes onto unfortunate passers-by. Streets weren't just dirty, they were biological minefields. Imagine being a night watchman in 14th century London, patrolling the alleys under moonlight, lantern in hand, when someone on the 3rd floor decides to dispose of their liquid troubles. It adds a new level of danger to the night shift, doesn't it? It's no wonder medieval shoes were thick-soled. They weren't a fashion statement, they were splash guards. Inside the castle, things were only slightly better. Wealthy nobles might have a garderobe, a small room built into the outer wall, where a narrow chute led down to the moat. It was the original en-suite, though perhaps not as glamorous as it sounds. Many castles developed an aroma best described as ancient compost heap meets wet limestone. Archaeologists studying castle ruins often find layers of waste frozen in time, literal centuries of royal decisions. Hygiene, as we think of it, wasn't a nightly ritual. There was no washing before bed, no brushing teeth, no skincare routine. Soap existed, but it was expensive and harsh. Peasants rarely used it. Instead, they might splash their face with cold water in the morning, and that was about it. The church even discouraged excessive bathing, warning it encouraged vanity or, worse, sinful thoughts. Some medieval theologians claimed that the body's natural oils were protective barriers created by God, which was a creative way to justify not washing. Still, people did try to smell a bit better. Herbs like rosemary, thyme, and lavender were popular for disguising odors. Women tucked them into sleeves, men rubbed them into their hair, and beds were sometimes sprinkled with dried petals to freshen the air. It didn't fix the problem, but it did make you smell like a slightly more elegant barnyard. For the wealthy, bathing could be a social or even romantic occasion. Bathhouses existed in many cities, wooden tubs filled with hot water, perfumed oils, and gossip. A night in a bathhouse might involve musicians, food, and sometimes things the church did not approve of. The baths were considered relaxing, but also a bit morally suspicious. Many towns eventually shut them down, not for hygiene reasons, but because people seemed to enjoy them too much. In private homes, baths were rare. Heating water was tedious and expensive, so people bathed only occasionally. The term Saturday bath comes from this, the idea that once a week was plenty. Families often shared the same water, one after another, starting with the father, then the mother, then the children. By the end, the tub looked more like soup. The baby usually went last, and there's an old saying that likely originated here: don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. It wasn't a metaphor, it was practical advice. Teeth brushing wasn't a nightly thing either. Toothpicks were popular, and some people rubbed their teeth with linen cloths or powdered charcoal. The results were mixed. Mouths often smelled like a medieval tavern, which, coincidentally, was where people spent most evenings. Wine, ale, and bread were safer than water, which was often contaminated. So, most people went to bed slightly tipsy and heavily unwashed, a combination that probably made sleeping easier. Now, about those sleep remedies. People in the Middle Ages had plenty of opinions about how to fall asleep, most of them questionable. Physicians of the time followed the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Sleep was thought to depend on balancing these fluids. Too much heat or dryness in the body caused insomnia. The remedy? Eat cooling foods, like lettuce, or drink milk mixed with poppy juice. Yes, opium. Imagine sipping that before bed. Medieval medicine wasn't exactly FDA approved. Other recommendations included eating lettuce boiled in vinegar, because who doesn't want sour salad water before bed, inhaling the scent of warm wine, or rubbing one's feet with pig fat. The more spiritual doctors suggested prayer, while the practical ones prescribed mild suffocation, sleeping under a heavy quilt to calm the spirits. Essentially, the first weighted blanket. Herbal mixtures were also common. Poppy, mandrake, and henbane were favorites, though they were more likely to put you in a coma than a peaceful sleep. Valerian root, chamomile, and lavender were safer options and actually used today. The medieval apothecary, though, didn't really measure dosages. A pinch could mean anything from a sprinkle to an entire handful, which made bedtime a bit of a gamble. You might sleep soundly, or see angels. Let's not forget the belief in sleep charms. People hung amulets above their beds, small crosses, carved stones, or pieces of iron, to ward off nightmares. Women sometimes tied herbs into little sachets called dream pillows, thought to summon pleasant visions. One medieval recipe for peaceful dreams involved stuffing a pillow with rose petals, chamomile, and the hair of a virgin. No one knows whose idea that was, or how one was supposed to acquire it, but it does suggest that bedtime was not free from superstition. Speaking of superstition, night itself was considered a liminal time, a moment when the boundary between worlds grew thin. People avoided whistling after dark, believing it called spirits. Mirrors were covered, to prevent the soul from wandering out. Candles were snuffed carefully, leaving one burning invited ghosts. And if a person died during the night, their window was opened immediately, so the soul could escape. Sleep wasn't just rest, it was a rehearsal for death. Even the arrangement of the bed mattered. Some believed that sleeping with your head to the north disturbed the humors, while others insisted that facing east was holier. In monasteries, monks slept sitting up, partly for discipline and partly to be ready for sudden prayers. They believed lying flat invited sloth, or worse, demonic temptation. Imagine being half asleep, sitting upright on a wooden bench, trying not to sin. It's not exactly the path to REM sleep. For the wealthy, there were also rules about servants' duties at night. A chamberlain might warm the bed by placing hot stones wrapped in cloth under the blankets. They'd ensure the bed curtains were drawn tight, the fire kept low, and the chamber pot nearby. In winter, some castles had braziers, small coal heaters, though these came with a risk of suffocation. Many noble families lost members to carbon monoxide long before anyone understood what it was. Peasants had no such luxuries. They relied on body heat, livestock, and prayer. The sounds of the night surrounded them: owls, wolves, the creak of wood, the wind scraping against the thatch. There was no silence, only a chorus of natural noises that became familiar, almost comforting. Children learned to recognize which sounds meant danger and which were just the house settling. It's strange to think how modern silence, that perfect stillness we associate with peace, might have felt unnerving to them. And then there was snoring. Oh, they snored. Chroniclers wrote about it, poets joked about it, and medical texts offered remedies for it, usually ineffective. One suggested tying a small stone to your hair so that when you rolled onto your back, it hurt enough to make you change position. Another recommended pouring vinegar up the nose, which, in fairness, would stop most things. There's even a record of one medieval doctor suggesting that snorers sleep with their heads hanging off the bed. The result, he promised, was an open passage for the vapors. He was half right. It definitely opened something. When people did wake in the night, they often used the time for reflection or prayer. There was even a word for it: the watch. During these quiet hours, the fire would be stirred, bread might be eaten, and sometimes neighbors would visit, the medieval version of a 2 a.m. chat. It wasn't odd to find people awake at midnight, sitting by a dim fire, discussing dreams or confessing small worries. Night had a social life of its own. If insomnia struck, physicians prescribed everything from warm milk to holding a live eel under the arm. Yes, that was a genuine treatment recorded in one 15th century text. Supposedly, it cooled the spirits. The eel was not consulted about its enthusiasm for this role. For more stubborn sleeplessness, there were more mystical options: whispering charms, saintly relics, or even reciting psalms backward. Monks warned against reading scripture upside down, as it could accidentally summon the devil, which is one of those hazards they don't tell you about in Sunday school. Yet, through all this, there's something charmingly human about it. The same desire for rest, the same search for calm, existed then as now. The difference was in the tools. Ours glow blue and buzz, theirs burned yellow and hissed. We take melatonin, they took boiled lettuce and faith. And in both worlds, people still whispered the same thought before closing their eyes: please, just let me sleep. So as you lie here, maybe imagine that faint medieval candle flickering beside your bed. The smell of herbs, the cold air sneaking in through a wooden shutter, and the comforting knowledge that, however odd their remedies, people back then were just as tired as you are now. Would you have tried any of those medieval sleep tricks, or do you think the live eel might be a bit much? Tell me what you think, down in the comments. After you've drifted off, of course. Let's quietly wander onward. Next, we'll drift into part 3, where night becomes more social. The strange world of medieval nightlife, taverns, curfews, and those who worked while everyone else slept. Hey everyone. Welcome back. If you're still awake, that's impressive. But let's be honest, you're not really trying to stay awake, are you? Tonight, we'll keep floating further through the dark corridors of medieval nights, the hours when people believed the world between the living and the dead grew thin, and the only thing standing between you and a visiting ghost was the firmness of your blanket and your ability to pretend to be asleep. So, let's drift softly into the strange universe of medieval dreams and demons, where sleep wasn't just rest, it was a full-blown moral and spiritual event. Now, the medieval world was obsessed with meaning. Nothing happened by accident. Not a cough, not a falling star, not even a bad dream. Everything had divine or demonic significance. So, when people fell asleep and their minds wandered into dreamland, they didn't wake up saying, that was weird. They said, yes, God, or possibly Satan, was trying to tell me something. Because of course he was. Dream interpretation wasn't new. It went all the way back to the ancient Greeks and Romans, but medieval Europeans added a special kind of anxious guilt to it. Dreaming about water. Maybe your soul was restless. Dreaming about flying. Possibly demonic temptation. Dreaming about bread. You're probably hungry, but also, somehow, sinful. And if you dreamed about anyone from church, well, that was a nightmare in more ways than one. Monks and priests, of course, loved writing about this stuff. They compiled entire dream dictionaries filled with moral warnings. Dreams weren't just little brain movies. They were battlefields where God and the devil played tug-of-war with your subconscious. If you dreamed of light, angels were nearby. If you dreamed of darkness or being crushed, well, you probably had a demon squatting on your chest. Literally. That's not an exaggeration. People genuinely believed that demons, known as incubi and succubi, prowled bedrooms at night, looking for sleeping humans to torment, or, seduce. The incubus was the male version, and the succubus was the female. Both were accused of climbing onto people as they slept, stealing their energy, or whispering temptations. The modern medical explanation is something called sleep paralysis, but to medieval people, it was just Tuesday night. So imagine, you've gone to bed on your straw mattress, the fire has burned low, and the darkness is thick enough to feel. You wake up suddenly, can't move, can't breathe, and you sense something pressing on your chest. Today, we'd say, relax, it's just a REM disorder. In the 14th century, they said, congratulations, you've met a demon. Artists even painted these scenes, shadowy figures crouched on helpless sleepers, cats glaring from the background, symbolizing witchcraft or sin. These paintings weren't meant to comfort anyone. They were meant to remind you that sleeping wasn't a break from morality, it was another test you could fail. But it wasn't all terror and theology. The night was also full of smaller, oddly practical superstitions. For example, people believed it was dangerous to sleep facing north. That direction supposedly aligned you with dark spirits or caused nightmares. Sleeping with your mouth open was bad too, since a passing spirit, or worse, a mouse, could slip in. And, naturally, you shouldn't sleep with your shoes near your head, because evil forces might walk in them. There was a superstition for every possible sleep arrangement, and nearly all of them sounded exhausting. Even pillows had moral baggage. In some early Christian traditions, sleeping too comfortably was seen as a sin of vanity. After all, Christ didn't have a feather pillow, so why should you? Monks often slept sitting up or on bare boards, to remind themselves of humility. There's a famous quote from a 12th century abbot who scolded his monks for the softness of their cushions. He called it a luxury unbecoming to men of God. You have to wonder if maybe he just needed a nap. Dreams were also deeply political. Kings and nobles sometimes made real decisions based on them. In the 11th century, William the Conqueror supposedly dreamed of a blood-soaked sword before invading England. His advisors took it as a divine sign. It could have just been a product of stress or bad wine, but that wasn't a satisfying explanation. Similarly, Queen Isabella of Castile once said she dreamed that God told her to finance Columbus's voyage. So yes, you could argue that one of history's greatest discoveries began as a particularly confident nap. In medieval medicine, dreams were also tied to the body's mysterious humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you had too much blood, you might dream of red objects or warfare. Too much black bile. Expect gloomy, depressing dreams. Doctors genuinely believed your internal fluids shaped your imagination at night. Which, come to think of it, might explain a few strange dreams we've all had after midnight snacks. Let's drift over now to one of the most curious aspects of medieval nightlife: the two sleeps. We touched on this before, but let's explore it more deeply. People in the Middle Ages didn't sleep straight through the night like we do now. Instead, they had a first sleep and a second sleep. Between them, around midnight, there was a waking period, anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours, where people got up and did small things. They prayed, tended fires, checked on animals, or even paid social visits. Yes, midnight chatting was normal. Imagine knocking on your neighbor's door at 1 a.m. just to talk about sheep prices. Perfectly acceptable. Scholars think this pattern made sense for a world without artificial light. When the sun went down, you went to bed. Around midnight, your body woke naturally, and you had a bit of quiet time to reflect, or, if you were unlucky, listen to rats in the rafters. Some used the time for devotions, which meant praying for their souls and anyone else who might be dying nearby. It's all very cozy and cheerful. But others, well, they took advantage of the break for less holy reasons. Letters and diaries from the period suggest that many couples found this between-sleep period ideal for intimacy. One 16th century English doctor even recommended it as the best and most natural time for conception. So yes, while medieval doctors didn't know about germs, they apparently had opinions about bedtime scheduling. If you woke up at midnight and couldn't fall back asleep, people said it might be because fairies or witches had brushed past your window. The solution: turn your pillow over to the cool side. It's amazing how some habits never die. Superstitions also guided what you could eat or drink before bed. For instance, it was believed that consuming onions or cheese at night could bring on troubling dreams. Garlic might make you dream of snakes. And, because this is the Middle Ages, drinking wine before bed might summon lustful visions or ghosts. Either way, people were very concerned with managing the dream menu. Let's take a slow breath here and drift into another corner of the night: the sounds. Medieval towns at night weren't silent. There were dogs barking, donkeys braying, the occasional distant church bell, and drunks singing their way home. For most people, night was a time of both peace and unease. Windows were shuttered tightly, not only to keep out the cold but to ward off spirits and thieves. The line between superstition and safety was blurry, like most things after dark. In castles, nights were filled with echoes: the clank of armor, the crackle of torches, the creak of massive wooden doors. Servants often slept in hallways, curled up near their masters' rooms, half asleep but ready to respond to any noise. Nobles sometimes kept candles burning all night, not because they were scared of the dark, though maybe they were, but because extinguishing and relighting candles was expensive. The church played a big role in defining what good sleep meant. Monks, for example, had their entire nights divided by bells. They would wake for midnight prayers called matins, then return to their beds for a short second sleep. The rhythm was designed to remind them that rest was temporary, while devotion was eternal. Not exactly a recipe for relaxation, but it made sense to them. Meanwhile, ordinary villagers viewed sleep as both physical and spiritual. Before bed, they often recited rhymes or charms to protect themselves. A common one from England went something like, "Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, bless the bed that I lie on." Simple, soothing, and just ominous enough to make you keep one eye open. Let's drift gently onward to the world of medieval dream visions, a literary and spiritual genre where people claimed to receive messages from beyond in their sleep. Monks wrote entire treatises about dream encounters with saints or angels. One famous story tells of a monk who dreamed he saw heaven and hell, only to wake up and write a 40-page moral essay about it. In short, dreams were homework. Women, too, sometimes recorded their divine dreams. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th-century nun and mystic, claimed her visions came in her sleep and were direct messages from God. Whether or not they were dreams or migraines, people took them seriously. If a holy person dreamed, it was prophecy. If a peasant dreamed, it was probably indigestion. There's a gentle irony in how much moral pressure was tied to something as natural as sleep. People worked from sunrise to sunset, then spent the night worrying about whether their dreams were holy enough. It's almost poetic, and very medieval. And here's something oddly comforting. Despite all the fear and superstition, people still found warmth in the night. They huddled together, shared blankets, whispered stories, prayed softly, and watched the firelight flicker. For all the demons and dreams, there was also community, an ancient, universal rhythm of drifting into rest under the same uncertain stars. So, what do you think? Would you have survived a medieval night without freaking out at every sound? Tell me down in the comments. And if you're not too sleepy yet, stay right here, because in our next part, we'll wander into the bizarre world of medieval beds, blankets, and the business of sleep, from royal mattresses stuffed with swan feathers to peasant piles of straw and bugs. Sweet dreams, or, at least, historically accurate ones. Hey there, welcome back. If you're still with me, that means either you're very committed to learning about medieval sleep or you've just forgotten to turn off autoplay. Either way, we're here together, so let's settle in. Maybe dim the lights a bit more. Tonight, we're sinking into something surprisingly complicated, the medieval bed. Or, more accurately, the hierarchy of beds, because, like everything else in that world, even sleeping came with a social ranking system. Let's start at the top. The bed of a medieval king or queen wasn't just a place to sleep. It was a symbol, a stage, and sometimes a political prop. Royal beds were so large and so grand that they could take up half a room. Picture carved oak frames towering like miniature fortresses, hung with thick curtains embroidered in gold thread, and piled high with cushions stuffed with feathers from swans or geese. The mattress itself might be layered with down, wool, and, occasionally, dried herbs like lavender or rosemary to keep away insects and, supposedly, evil spirits. A royal bed was the most private object in a world that valued display. And yet, curiously, royal sleep wasn't very private. Monarchs were almost never alone. They had attendants sleeping nearby, sometimes even in the same room, ready to respond to any midnight need, a drink, a prayer, or, more likely, a paranoid fear that someone was plotting to murder them. In fact, in many courts, the act of going to bed was practically a ceremony. There was something called the royal coucher, or the going-to-bed ritual. Attendants helped the king undress, offered perfumed hand-washing water, brought fresh linens, and made sure the fire burned at the right level. Then, once the monarch was tucked in, they all bowed and left, except a few unlucky guards who got to sit in the dark all night listening to royal snoring. But even kings had complaints. Henry VIII, for instance, was famous for moving beds around constantly because he feared assassination. He'd have multiple chambers prepared, each with a bed, and no one, sometimes not even his wives, knew which one he'd actually sleep in. That's less sleep hygiene and more paranoid musical chairs, but it worked for him. For the upper classes, beds also served another purpose: politics. Marriage negotiations, business discussions, even peace treaties sometimes happened while sitting or reclining on beds. Hosting someone in your bedchamber was a sign of immense trust. It was intimate, but not necessarily romantic. In a way, beds were like the medieval version of boardrooms, except softer and with more fleas. Now, let's drift down a few rungs on the social ladder. For the middle class, merchants, artisans, minor officials, beds were still prized possessions, but they looked more modest. Wooden frames were common, often painted or carved, but the bedding itself depended on wealth. A wool-stuffed mattress was standard. Straw-filled mattresses were cheaper. People often layered sheets made of coarse linen, topped with blankets woven from wool or fur. The richer you were, the more layers you could afford. And in a charmingly practical move, people didn't waste heat by sleeping alone. Families shared beds, sometimes even with servants. Privacy was almost non-existent. In towns, apprentices often slept in the same room, or even the same bed, as their masters, which sounds awkward, but was just normal life. Children might sleep in a trundle bed, a smaller frame that slid out from beneath the parents' bed, like a medieval bunk system for people who couldn't afford space. The real contrast appears when we reach the peasantry. For poor villagers, a bed was often just a pile of straw in a wooden frame, or, in smaller cottages, simply a straw mattress on the floor near the hearth. The straw was called a palliasse, and it wasn't particularly soft. To make it more comfortable, people sometimes mixed in dried leaves or moss. Over time, this straw got dirty, damp, and full of little crawling surprises. That's where the expression "hit the hay" comes from, because you literally had to fluff and shake the hay before lying down, hoping to dislodge whatever was living in it. Sheets, if they existed at all, were rough and unbleached. Most peasants slept fully clothed, or in a long shirt that doubled as a day garment. They didn't have the luxury of a nightgown. That was for the gentry, the people with wardrobes big enough to label sleepwear. Still, the hearth provided warmth, and the family huddled together for comfort. Children, parents, sometimes even visiting relatives, all piled into one space. It wasn't romanticized, it was just survival. Winters were harsh, and medieval homes leaked heat like sieves. The family bed became a kind of human heating system, fueled by body warmth and necessity. Beds also had to be multifunctional. In tiny cottages, the bed doubled as a bench during the day or even a place to store things. Some were built high off the ground so that chickens or small animals could sleep underneath. Waste not, want not. It's an image that feels strangely cozy, in a rustic, mildly unhygienic sort of way. Let's not forget about bedbugs and fleas, the medieval roommates nobody wanted. They were everywhere. Even the nobility couldn't fully escape them. Lavish beds often had hangings and curtains, which provided perfect hiding spots for insects. People tried to fight them with herbs. Lavender, wormwood, mint, and camphor were common repellents. Servants were tasked with beating the mattresses and hanging bedding out in the sun to drive pests away. And yet, the struggle was constant. There's a record from a 15th-century noblewoman complaining in a letter that she'd been bitten cruelly, despite sleeping on the finest feather bed. No one, it seems, was immune. Even the king's backside wasn't safe from nature's small rebellions. The word bed itself carried a lot of cultural weight. In medieval literature, beds were places of birth, death, and confession. A noble might be born to the bed of a great house, meaning legitimate descent. And when someone died, they were said to go to their long bed. So, symbolically, beds were the bookends of life. Everything began and ended there. Let's float now to the subject of bed-making, which, yes, was a full-blown art form. Servants were expected to make beds daily, though making didn't mean what it does now. It wasn't about decorative pillows or crisp sheets. It was a matter of hygiene and superstition. People believed beds could trap miasma or bad air, which caused sickness. So bedding was regularly aired out. Some even sprinkled holy water over beds to drive away illness and nightmares. The wealthier families also displayed their beds as a mark of prestige. If you were rich enough, you might even take your bed with you when you traveled. Literally. Noble households had portable beds that could be dismantled, packed, and reassembled wherever the family stayed. They were called field beds, and yes, they came with their own hangings, canopies, and attendants to set them up. Imagine trying to pack that for a weekend trip. In towns, the rise of guilds and trade meant more people could afford proper bedding. We even find early inventories from the 14th century listing 1 feather mattress, 2 blankets, and 1 bolster. These lists read like quiet snapshots of domestic life, proof that comfort, even modest comfort, mattered deeply to people who lived with so little. And comfort was changing. By the late Middle Ages, linen weaving improved, making sheets smoother and more affordable. Beds became a symbol not just of status, but of civilization itself. Sleeping off the ground meant safety, separation from dirt, and a bit of dignity. The materials themselves tell stories. Wool blankets were common, of course, but fur was prized by nobles, sable, marten, and even ermine. They weren't just for warmth, they were displays of power. The colder the castle, the more luxurious the fur. And then there were pillows. Medieval pillows were often small, flat, and filled with wool or feathers. Too many pillows, however, suggested vanity. Moderation was key, comfort, but not decadence. In some cultures, like in monastic settings, sleeping without a pillow was a sign of humility. Some saints were even praised for rejecting soft bedding altogether. Saint Francis of Assisi, for example, was said to sleep on the bare ground, using a rock for a pillow. Admirable, perhaps, but not recommended. Let's drift briefly toward color and decoration. Rich beds were decorated in deep reds, greens, and blues, colors linked to wealth and virtue. Red was particularly popular because it symbolized life and strength, and also conveniently hid stains. Curtains were embroidered with family crests, saints, or floral patterns. The bed wasn't just furniture, it was art, identity, and advertisement rolled into one. Even the smallest details could carry meaning. A noblewoman might embroider her initials on pillowcases as a mark of ownership. A monk might carve crosses into the bed frame to keep away evil. And if you were particularly cautious, you'd sleep with a blessed relic or rosary under your pillow, just in case the night got spiritually eventful. One of my favorite oddities is the marriage bed tradition. When noble couples married, their first night together was a public event. Well, almost public. They were ceremoniously escorted to bed by attendants and witnesses, who ensured everything was properly begun. Curtains were drawn, the room was cleared, and theoretically, that was that. It sounds mortifying, but it was considered essential for legal legitimacy. Imagine the pressure of knowing your marriage's political future depended on a crowd waiting outside your door. Sleep well indeed. For ordinary people, though, marriage beds were humble but sacred. They were the center of family life, the place where children were conceived, born, and sometimes even died. Many wills included instructions about who would inherit the great bed, because it was often the most valuable piece of furniture in the house. So, whether it was a royal canopy draped in silk or a peasant straw mat by the fire, the bed was never just a place to sleep. It was a statement of power, poverty, faith, or love. And maybe, in a strange way, it still is. If you could choose, would you rather sleep in a royal feather bed guarded by knights, or in a humble cottage near the fire, wrapped in a rough wool blanket? Let me know down in the comments before you drift off completely. Next time, we'll wander quietly into part 5, where we'll explore the surprisingly complicated business of who people slept with. And no, not in the scandalous sense, but the literal one. How families, servants, and strangers shared beds, and what that said about trust, warmth, and the social order of sleep. So for now, close your eyes, imagine the flicker of a single candle beside you, and drift softly into that old drafty room of history. Good night, for now. Hey there, still awake? If you are, that's fine. This isn't the sort of history that demands full attention. It's the kind that seeps into your mind like warm candlelight. Tonight, we're curling up beside the hearth of medieval life to talk about something that might sound a little scandalous at first: sharing beds. But don't worry, this isn't that kind of story. It's not about passion or affairs. It's about survival, companionship, and the oddly communal way people used to sleep before privacy was invented. Let's start with something obvious. Most medieval people didn't have the luxury of sleeping alone. Beds were expensive, and warmth was precious. Even in noble households, people doubled up, or tripled, or more. Sharing a bed wasn't strange, and it certainly wasn't shameful. It was as normal as sharing a fire, a loaf of bread, or a jug of ale. The modern idea of a private bedroom didn't really exist. Rooms were multipurpose, families were large, and servants slept where space allowed. A noble couple might have their own chamber, but their children, attendants, or even guests could be sleeping just a few feet away, separated only by a curtain or tapestry. Sound traveled easily through those stone walls, and so did the snoring. Now, for the lower classes, things were even more communal. Imagine a one-room cottage with a central hearth and a couple of straw mattresses. Parents, children, and sometimes even visiting neighbors might share the same bedding to keep warm. In the coldest months, animals, especially pigs or dogs, might be allowed inside for added heat. You can picture it, a jumble of blankets, people, and livestock, everyone half asleep, half frozen, breathing in rhythm with the fire. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. In a world without central heating or thick walls, body heat was a survival strategy. To bed meant not just rest, but gathering together against the dark. Even among travelers, shared beds were the norm. If you were on the road and stopped at an inn, you'd pay for a place in a bed, not the whole bed itself. That meant sleeping next to whoever else happened to arrive that night, strangers, merchants, or pilgrims. It sounds awkward, but it was accepted etiquette. Inns weren't places for comfort, they were for shelter. And the idea of refusing to share would have seemed rude or snobbish. Some travelers wrote about this with weary amusement. One Englishman in the 15th century complained that he'd gone to sleep next to a Scotsman who spoke to himself all night. Another described waking up between two snoring monks, convinced he was being punished for his sins. The discomfort was universal, but so was the understanding. Of course, not all shared beds were equal. Among the wealthy, sharing could be a sign of trust. Lords often slept in the same room, or even in the same bed, as favored companions or attendants. It wasn't about romance, it was about loyalty and status. A bedfellow could be a trusted friend or political ally. In some royal courts, being invited to share a bed with a monarch was considered an extraordinary honor. It meant access, confidence, and influence. For example, young noblemen serving in royal households sometimes shared the king's bed for companionship and protection. It was an old custom, left over from times when sleeping in groups was normal for safety reasons. Henry VIII did this as a boy when he was still a prince, though he later grew suspicious and stopped the practice, probably after realizing that bedfellows were also excellent spies. The word bedfellow itself used to have none of the romantic connotations it does today. You could be someone's bedfellow simply because the room was cold and there weren't enough mattresses to go around. Political writings of the time even used the term metaphorically. Alliances between nobles were sometimes called strange bedfellows, long before Shakespeare made the phrase famous. And yet, the closeness of shared sleep sometimes created unexpected bonds. People who slept beside one another, friends, siblings, even servants, often spoke of the experience as comforting, intimate in a familial way. The rhythm of breathing, the quiet of darkness, and the shared vulnerability of sleep created small, human connections in a harsh world. Children almost always shared with siblings. In wealthier homes, they might have their own small truckle beds that slid under their parents' larger ones. At night, the children were rolled out like drawers, tucked beside the parental bed for warmth and safety. In the morning, their beds slid back to make space. It's both clever and strangely sweet, a tidy way to fit family life into small quarters. For the very young, there was the cradle, a wooden or wicker structure, often rocked gently by the mother or even tied to the parent's bed frame so it could be nudged without getting up. Babies frequently slept with their mothers, though this carried its own risks. Medieval parenting manuals warned mothers against overlaying, accidentally rolling onto the baby in the night. To prevent this, some beds had wooden guards or low partitions between the infant and adult sleepers. Monasteries, however, were an entirely different world. Monks and nuns slept communally, but separately by gender. In many monasteries, dormitories lined with narrow, curtained cubicles stretched along one wall. Each monk had a straw mattress and a blanket, sometimes even a little shelf for his belongings. But they were expected to sleep fully clothed, ready to wake at the bell for midnight prayers. No one lingered long in bed. Comfort was discouraged, and silence was absolute. If someone snored too loudly, well, that was probably considered another test of patience. The rules were even stricter for nuns. Their beds were arranged neatly in rows, like quiet ships in a harbor. Curtains were allowed for modesty, but only plain ones. Each nun's bed was identical, because equality before God didn't leave room for decorative flair. The idea was to discourage worldly attachment, even to something as small as a soft pillow. Outside the cloister, though, sleep was full of human warmth. Apprentices, for instance, usually lived with their masters, sleeping in attics or near the workshop. They might share one large bed or a line of straw mattresses. These arrangements blurred the line between family and labor. The workshop wasn't just a workplace, it was home, school, and dormitory all in one. Let's drift over to royal households for a moment. Servants in castles also shared quarters, often sleeping in the same room as their employers but separated by curtains or partitions. Ladies' maids might sleep near their mistress's door, guards dozed in hallways, swords within reach. The larger the household, the more crowded the sleeping arrangements. Privacy was a rare and luxurious thing, so rare that when someone did have a chamber to themselves, it became a status symbol almost as impressive as fine clothing. And speaking of privacy, it's worth noting that the concept of personal space wasn't really a thing. People lived closer together in every sense, physically, emotionally, and socially. The walls were thin, the rooms were shared, and secrets were fragile. Sleep, like everything else, was communal. Even marriages reflected this practicality. A husband and wife sharing a bed wasn't about romance, it was about partnership, warmth, and reproduction. Marriage beds were both symbolic and functional. Newlyweds were often blessed in bed by priests or family members, not the most romantic way to start the honeymoon. But to the medieval mind, the bed was sacred, a symbol of duty and continuity. Now, because everyone slept so close, there were naturally a few inconveniences. Snoring was a universal complaint. Some medieval writings even reference prayers for patience toward those who snore in the night. Bed manners mattered. Elbowing someone in their sleep, hogging the blanket, or talking too much could earn you scolding, or in some monasteries, formal penance. And then there was the matter of cleanliness. Shared beds meant shared problems. Fleas, lice, and other unwelcome guests didn't care about social boundaries. Bathing was infrequent, laundering sheets was labor-intensive, and bedding absorbed everything: sweat, smoke, and smells. Many households aired out bedding in the morning by hanging it outside windows or over bushes. Sunlight was the only disinfectant they had. Some inns offered clean sheets, though that claim was always suspicious. Travelers often carried their own linens, just to be safe. It was said that the only thing worse than sleeping in a dirty bed was paying for one. One 15th-century traveler described waking up to find his sheet alive with movement. He wrote about it with remarkable calm, which tells you just how low expectations were. Still, there's a strangely endearing side to it all. Shared sleep meant shared stories. People whispered in the dark, swapped gossip, prayed, or talked about dreams. The night was a time for connection, not isolation. Before sleep, families recited blessings together. Children drifted off listening to their parents murmur. In those moments, the world must have felt smaller, safer, more human. Even in courts and castles, the closeness of shared rest created strange dynamics. There are records of servants growing intensely loyal or jealous of the people they slept beside. Trust was literally built overnight. And maybe, in a world where your survival depended on others, there was comfort in knowing someone was always within reach. It's easy to romanticize that now, from the comfort of our individual mattresses and personal bedrooms. But back then, solitude would have felt cold and eerie. Sleeping alone wasn't freedom, it was isolation. The night was full of dangers, real and imagined. Thieves, spirits, sickness, and silence were all enemies. Better to have company, even noisy company, than none at all. By the end of the Middle Ages, though, the culture of sleep slowly began to change. The wealthy started to crave more privacy. Separate chambers for men and women appeared in noble households. Servants were moved further away. Curtains grew thicker. Walls went up. Solitude became a mark of refinement. It was the beginning of the modern bedroom, though it took centuries to trickle down to ordinary homes. Still, the traces of that old closeness linger. Even today, we tuck children in with soft lights and stories, echoing the ancient rhythm of shared warmth. Maybe we've traded body heat for blankets, but the instinct is the same. Night is safer when someone else is near. So, if you were living back then, who would you want as your bedfellow? A loyal friend? A fellow traveler? A snoring monk? Or maybe just a friendly dog by the fire? Tell me down in the comments before your eyelids win this battle. Next time, we'll drift quietly into part 6, where we'll explore what people did when they couldn't sleep, the strange midnight rituals, prayers, and even late-night snacks that filled those long medieval hours. For now, Stay warm, wherever you are. And if you hear a creak in the night, don't worry, it's probably just history whispering. Imagine it's the middle of the night in a small medieval village. The hearth has gone out, the room is dark except for a few glowing coals, and the world feels suspended between one breath and the next. You lie awake, staring into the blackness, listening to the steady breathing of others in the same bed. The sounds of the night creep in, the faint drip of water from the roof, the soft shuffling of animals in the barn, the distant barking of a dog. You try to fall asleep again, but your mind won't settle. What did people do when they couldn't sleep, hundreds of years before warm milk and glowing phone screens? Turns out, a lot more than you might think. Let's start with something fascinating. The medieval world didn't expect people to sleep through the night in one solid block. In fact, they had something called first sleep and second sleep. This pattern wasn't considered strange, it was the normal rhythm of rest. People would go to bed not long after sunset, sleep for 3 or 4 hours, then wake up around midnight. During this wakeful period, they might stay in bed, pray, talk quietly, or even get up and do small chores. Then, after an hour or two, they'd drift back into their second sleep, which lasted until dawn. This idea appears everywhere in old writings, letters, diaries, even religious texts. A 13th-century monk described how he used the time between sleeps to meditate on God's word. A 15th-century farmer wrote about checking on his animals during that midnight lull. Even physicians of the time mentioned it in medical treatises, advising patients to rise gently after the first sleep and take a draught of warm wine if troubled by phlegm. It sounds odd to us now, but it makes sense when you think about how the world worked. Artificial light was scarce. Candles were expensive, lamps were smoky, and firewood was precious. People's days revolved around the sun. Once it set, the darkness was absolute and long. Breaking the night into 2 halves gave structure to those endless hours. So when sleep wouldn't come, no one panicked. Wakefulness was part of the pattern. During that middle stretch of the night, called the watch, many people used the time for quiet reflection. It was thought to be a spiritually potent hour, closer to the divine because the world was still and silent. Priests and monks often held midnight prayers known as matins or vigils, rising from their beds in the cold to chant in dimly lit chapels. The sound of those distant bells might drift over sleeping villages, a reminder that somewhere, someone was awake for holy reasons. Ordinary folk had their own rituals. Some recited prayers or psalms, thanking God for their health, harvest, or family. Others whispered charms to keep away evil spirits or bad dreams. Night was a dangerous time, after all. The darkness was full of uncertainty, witches, demons, sickness, or thieves. Even the creaking of wood or the hoot of an owl could feel like an omen. So a little prayer before turning over for the second sleep wasn't superstition, it was self-defense. But not everyone spent their wakeful hours in pious thought. Some used the time for more earthly matters. Married couples might talk quietly or share intimacy. Doctors even recommended this interval between sleeps as the ideal time for conception, since the body was rested and the night still. For others, it was a chance for whispered conversation, secret planning, or even sneaking out for a stroll if the moon was bright enough. In towns, you might hear the sound of night watchmen calling the hour, clanking their staffs to assure everyone they were safe. In cities like London or Paris, the curfew bell marked when fires had to be extinguished and doors locked. But after the bell faded, some people still moved about, bakers preparing dough, brewers checking their vats, guards pacing along the walls. The world never truly slept. Now, if insomnia lasted longer than a typical watch, medieval people had all sorts of explanations. Doctors, who based their ideas on the ancient theories of humors, believed that sleeplessness came from an imbalance in the body. Too much hot or dry humors, like yellow bile, could excite the mind and keep someone awake. Melancholy or excessive black bile could fill the mind with dark, restless thoughts. The cure? Adjust the diet, bleed the patient, or prescribe soothing herbs. Herbal remedies for sleeplessness were surprisingly familiar. Poppy seeds, valerian root, lettuce juice, chamomile, and hops were all recommended to calm the body and encourage sleep. Warm milk mixed with honey and a pinch of nutmeg was a common home cure, comforting then, just as it is now. Some doctors also advised rubbing the temples with a salve made of violet oil and goose fat, or sleeping with a sprig of rosemary under the pillow to cool the mind. Others suggested listening to gentle music played on a lute or harp, believing that harmony soothed the soul. The medical term for it was balancing the spirits. And then there were the stranger cures. One 14th-century medical book suggested holding a carved piece of jet stone in the left hand until drowsiness came. Another claimed that placing a piece of raw onion under the bed would draw away vapors that trouble the head. A particularly creative physician advised reciting Psalm 4, "I will lay me down in peace and sleep," exactly 7 times before turning over, to guarantee rest. Of course, sometimes sleeplessness wasn't physical, it was emotional. People worried then, just as we do now, about bad harvests, debts, sickness, missing relatives. The dark had a way of magnifying fear. One chronicler described lying awake, troubled by the turning of my thoughts as by rats in the walls. In castles and great houses, insomnia could take a more luxurious form. Nobles sometimes summoned their servants to read aloud until they dozed off, or to play soft instruments in adjoining chambers. One French queen reportedly kept a small fountain by her bed. The sound of trickling water helped her sleep. Another noblewoman filled her room with lavender, rosemary, and juniper, believing the scent purified the air and warded off nightmares. Speaking of nightmares, they were taken very seriously. Medieval people believed dreams were either divine messages or demonic attacks. The word nightmare originally referred to a malicious spirit, a mare, that sat on a sleeper's chest and suffocated them. What we'd now call sleep paralysis was explained as the work of demons or witches. To prevent this, people used protective charms, iron knives under pillows, crucifixes above the bed, or prayers written on scraps of parchment and tucked into mattresses. One common blessing went, "In this bed may angels rest and devils flee." Children were taught to cross themselves before sleep to keep away the mare. But there were gentler beliefs too. Some thought dreams were reflections of the soul's wanderings. A restless night might mean the spirit was troubled or distracted. That's why morning prayers often included a request for peaceful slumber and harmless dreams. Now, in the countryside, the rhythm of insomnia often followed the rhythm of the land. Farmers and shepherds woke easily, attuned to animals and weather. They might use the wakeful hours to stoke the fire, check the sky, or listen to the wind for signs of change. Old folk sayings even encourage this. The wise man wakes between sleeps to hear the whisper of God in the wind. And sometimes, sleeplessness simply led to midnight companionship. Neighbors or families who shared beds might whisper together, telling stories, confessing worries, laughing softly in the dark. For children, these midnight talks were a source of wonder. Many medieval lullabies mention the quiet hour between sleeps, when mothers hummed softly while waiting for slumber to return. Monks, too, knew insomnia well. Their strict schedules required waking at precise times for prayers, often after only a few hours of rest. Some wrote of the struggle to stay awake in freezing cloisters, swaying with exhaustion as they chanted Latin verses. Others saw the sleeplessness itself as holy, a chance to suffer a little more for faith. One Benedictine monk, writing in the 12th century, described his insomnia like this: "When my eyes will not close, I count not sheep, but sins." In the dark, the mind is laid bare. It's a hauntingly human confession. For the wealthy, the problem of sleeplessness occasionally inspired invention. Some tried elaborate bedding, feather mattresses, silk sheets, even fur-lined covers. The beds themselves became enormous constructions, 4-poster frames with heavy curtains to shut out drafts and light. The curtains also created a sense of privacy, a cocoon where one could drift away from the noisy world. And yet, despite all this, the night still had a certain magic. It wasn't just something to be endured, it was a space for reflection, intimacy, and small acts of humanity. If you walked through a medieval village at midnight, you might see a few glowing windows, hear a soft chant from a monastery, or catch the faint murmur of voices through the walls. Life continued quietly in the dark. Even the stars seemed closer then. With no city lights to dull them, the sky was vast and brilliant. Many people believed insomnia was a sign that God wanted to show them something, a dream, a thought, or a glimpse of creation's beauty. One anonymous writer said, "I woke at midnight and looked upon the stars, and my heart was calmed." That's the thing about sleeplessness. It connects us to every human before and after us. The same stillness, the same thoughts, the same restless turning beneath blankets. We like to think our modern insomnia is unique, caused by screens and stress, But the truth is that people have always wrestled with the night. Maybe, in some way, those old customs, the first and second sleep, the quiet prayers, the shared warmth, were gentler ways of making peace with wakefulness. Instead of fighting it, people welcomed it, folded it into the rhythm of life. So the next time you wake in the middle of the night and can't drift back, imagine yourself in that world. The embers glowing, the house silent except for breathing. Maybe a distant church bell marking the hour. Maybe the soft sigh of wind through wooden shutters. You're not alone in the dark, you're sharing it with centuries of restless souls. And who knows? Maybe the universe is a little quieter at that hour for a reason. Maybe the medievals were right, the middle of the night is a moment meant for thought, not frustration. So close your eyes. Let the air feel heavy and ancient. You've already survived the first sleep. The second one is waiting, just beyond the edge of thought. Hey there, still awake? That's all right. Tonight, we're not fighting sleep, we're just drifting through it, as the medieval world once did. You've already heard about their odd beds, their segmented nights, and their candlelit rituals. Now we step into the deeper, softer space, where sleep slips into dreams, and dreams slip into something much stranger. For the medieval person, dreams were not random nonsense. They were messages, signs, and sometimes warnings. Every dream meant something. The question was, what and who sent it? In the dim candlelight of monasteries and castles, dreams were treated like delicate letters from the unseen world. Some came from God, others from demons, and some, inconveniently, from the stomach. The last category was politely referred to as dreams of digestion. If you dreamed about being chased by geese after eating goose stew, well, that wasn't prophecy, it was indigestion. Medieval physicians were clear about this. As one 14th-century medical text put it, "He who eats garlic at night will dream of wars." But the church was less amused by dream logic. For them, dreams were serious spiritual territory. St. Augustine wrote that dreams could be tools of divine revelation, but also of temptation. To dream of angels might be holy. To dream of anything less pure could mean your soul was wandering in dangerous places. People even confessed sinful dreams as moral failings. It was possible, in theory, to dream yourself into trouble. Still, dreams fascinated everyone. Priests, peasants, kings, all wanted to know what their sleeping minds were saying. Dream books, or somnialia, were surprisingly common. These were hand-copied guides listing hundreds of dream symbols and their supposed meanings. Dream of gold. Prosperity is coming. Dream of snakes. Enemies nearby. Dream of teeth falling out. Someone close to you will die, or you're just out of medieval toothpaste. One of the most popular guides was the Dream Book of Daniel, which claimed to interpret dreams in the spirit of the prophet. It circulated all over Europe, filled with neat, comforting certainties. If you dreamed of crossing a river, it meant deliverance. If you dreamed of climbing a tree, it meant advancement in life. It was sort of like a medieval horoscope, soothingly vague, oddly specific, and endlessly interpretable. But others took dream interpretation more seriously. Scholars like Macrobius, a Roman philosopher whose works were still studied in the Middle Ages, divided dreams into categories. Visio, a prophetic vision; oraculum, a dream that speaks truth; insomnium, a nightmare born of anxiety; and phantasma, a purely imaginative dream. Monks debated which dreams to trust and which to ignore, while theologians argued that some dreams were tests sent by God, moral puzzles for the faithful to interpret. To the ordinary person, though, dreams were more personal. They revealed the private fears and wishes of daily life. A farmer might dream of a barren field after a bad harvest. A mother might dream of her children walking through golden light, and take it as a sign they'd be blessed. Dreams gave meaning to the uncertain world around them. Nightmares, of course, were another matter. The medieval world had a very specific explanation for those. They believed nightmares were caused by a demon called the Mara, a malicious spirit who crept into bedrooms and sat on the sleeper's chest, suffocating them. That's where the word nightmare comes from. Across Europe, people described similar encounters: an invisible weight pressing down, the inability to move, the feeling of being watched. Today we call it sleep paralysis, but back then, it was an assault by something supernatural. Artists even painted it, a shadowy creature perched on a sleeper's chest, staring out of the darkness with luminous eyes. To ward off the Mara, People hung iron knives by the bed, drew crosses on their doors, or kept candles burning through the night. In Iceland, people blamed a creature called the Maracona, a spirit woman who entered through keyholes. In Germany, she was Die Nachtmar, sometimes described as a witch or a goblin. In England, she became the hag. The experience was universal, but the stories varied. And yet, in all versions, the theme was the same. Sleep was a gateway, and sometimes, something nasty slipped through. Curiously, this fear didn't make people avoid dreaming. It just made them more cautious. The boundary between the physical and spiritual world felt thinner in sleep. Many people believed that during dreams, the soul left the body and wandered. That's why some monks warned never to wake a sleeper too suddenly. You might startle the soul before it returned. Even more curious, some believed that saints could visit dreams to deliver messages. Pilgrims often claimed that a holy figure had appeared in their sleep, urging them to visit a shrine or perform an act of charity. These dream visions sometimes turned into pilgrimages that shaped whole communities. Dreams could also be used politically. Monarchs and nobles sometimes claimed divine dreams to justify decisions. Joan of Arc, for example, described her visions, voices and dreams of saints, as her calling. Kings and queens occasionally used dreams as excuses for action. If a ruler dreamed of victory, it was seen as divine approval. If they dreamed of disaster, they might cancel entire campaigns. King Henry I of England, according to chroniclers, once dreamed that his crown melted on his head like wax. A week later, he fell ill and died. Naturally, everyone decided the dream had foretold it, because medieval storytelling always made sure things lined up neatly in the end. Not every dream was so grand. Many were downright mundane. Dreaming of spilled ale, lost shoes, or runaway pigs could send someone into a frenzy of interpretation. Some households kept dream interpreters, wise women or priests who could read meaning from such things. It was a little like calling a therapist, but with more incense. In monasteries, dreams often sparked anxiety. A monk might dream of eating meat during Lent and wake in horror, convinced he'd sinned in spirit. Others dreamed of their dead relatives, which was taken as a sign those souls were suffering in purgatory. That meant prayers were urgently required, and often donations to the church. Dreams, it turned out, were good for both faith and fundraising. But not all dreams were taken seriously. Some were treated with gentle humor. There's a story from 13th century France about a peasant who dreamed of finding a chest of gold. He told his priest, who said it was foolish vanity. The peasant disagreed, and a week later, while digging for firewood, he found a buried hoard of coins. The priest then declared the dream divine. The moral: even medieval theology had some flexibility when treasure was involved. It's easy to laugh at their dream obsession, but consider this: without science, dreams were the only way to glimpse the mysterious. The world was filled with things people couldn't explain: disease, weather, fate. Dreams offered a way to make sense of it all. They turned chaos into narrative. And they weren't wrong about everything. Modern research shows dreams do reflect emotion, memory, and even physical sensations. Maybe medieval dreamers were just using the tools they had. Still, their interpretations could get wildly creative. Dreaming of water meant purity. Unless the water was dirty, then it meant sin. Dreaming of fire meant passion, or the wrath of God, depending on context. Dreaming of bread meant sustenance. Unless you were poor, then it probably meant you were hungry. In other words, the rules bent to suit the dreamer. Some dreams became legends in their own right. The 12th century writer Geoffrey of Monmouth claimed that Merlin's prophecies came through dreams. Later, poets like Chaucer and Dante turned dream imagery into vast literary visions. The Divine Comedy is, at its heart, one long medieval dream, a journey through heaven, hell, and everything in between. For women, dreams sometimes offered rare freedom. Medieval society was rigid, but in dreams, anyone could be anything. Nuns wrote about mystical unions with Christ, describing them in language both spiritual and startlingly intimate. Lay women dreamed of saints appearing to them, granting comfort or warnings. These dreams gave voice to feelings they couldn't express while awake. One fascinating diary from a 15th century woman named Marjorie Kemp records her vivid dream life, full of angels, temptations, and divine rebukes. Her confessor thought her hysterical. Historians today might call her imaginative. But for her, dreams were proof that her soul was in conversation with heaven. And of course, there were dreams of death. These were taken very seriously. To dream of your own death meant transformation, a sign that your soul was preparing for judgment. To dream of a dead relative could mean they needed prayers, or, occasionally, that they'd come to warn you of danger. Such dreams were rarely ignored. Families might light candles or give alms to speed the soul's peace. The border between dream and waking was soft. Many people kept dream relics, items tied to dreams they believed were holy. A ribbon, a coin, a stone. Sometimes, they even placed these under pillows to invite similar dreams again. Dreaming became a form of devotion. And perhaps the most touching part is this: medieval people often prayed for good dreams. Not success, not wealth, not happiness, but peaceful sleep filled with pleasant visions. Because to dream sweetly was to live in harmony with one's soul. When dawn came, dreams dissolved like mist. People might recount them to friends over bread and ale, comparing omens and symbols. Or they might quietly carry them, like secret letters no one else could read. In that sense, medieval dreamers weren't so different from us. They searched for meaning in the fragments of the night. So, as you lie there, somewhere between waking and sleep, maybe the old dreamers were right to listen so closely. Maybe the mind does wander to mysterious places, and maybe not every dream needs decoding. Some are just small gifts from the dark, reminders that imagination never truly sleeps. Now, take a slow breath. If you dream tonight of castles or candles or saints whispering under starry skies, don't worry. It's just your mind, still wandering through history. And tell me, if you could send a message through a dream to someone 1,000 years ago, what would you say? Let me know softly, in the comments below. Hey everyone, welcome back. Settle in, get comfortable, maybe pull the blanket up just a little higher. Tonight, we're drifting into a softer, darker corner of medieval nights, the realm of dreams. The people of the Middle Ages didn't just see dreams as random flickers of imagination. To them, dreams were messages. Sometimes divine, sometimes demonic, often confusing, and always taken seriously. So let's dim the candlelight a little and wander through a few centuries where your dream could make or break your reputation, your fortune, or even your life. The medieval world was full of signs. Every sneeze, bird cry, or odd-shaped cloud meant something. So, naturally, when people closed their eyes at night and saw strange visions, they assumed it wasn't just their brain at play. No, this was the universe, or God, or the devil, sending mail straight to their soul. You could say that dreams were the medieval version of late-night texts from the cosmos. And unlike modern texts, you couldn't just ignore them. In monasteries, monks wrote long treatises on dream interpretation. Theologians tried to categorize dreams into the good, the bad, and the probably diabolical. They believed God could speak to the faithful through dreams, as he had done in the Bible, Joseph, Daniel, and that Pharaoh with his 7 fat cows. But, on the other hand, the devil was known for his creativity, and dreams were an easy access point for spiritual mischief. So, if you dreamt about your neighbor's wife, you might wake up in panic, not from guilt, but because you might have just been tricked by a demon into spiritual ruin. There were even dream manuals circulating among scholars and courtiers. They listed symbols and their meanings with delightful confidence. Dreaming of fish. Prosperity. Dreaming of fire. Anger or lust. Dreaming of bread. A sign of peace. Dreaming of being chased by a pig. Apparently, someone was plotting against you. Dreaming of your teeth falling out. That one was universal, bad luck, possibly death. Which, to be fair, is still the consensus on TikTok today. Among the wealthy, dreams could be political weapons. If a king or noble dreamt something, it was written down and discussed by priests and advisors as if it were a royal decree. A monarch's dream could justify a war or condemn an ally. One famous tale tells of Emperor Constantine, who supposedly saw a glowing cross in a dream before battle, with the words, "In this sign, conquer." Naturally, he won, and the dream became a cornerstone of Christian imperial power. It's hard to say whether he really dreamt it or just realized that claiming divine bedtime advice was good politics. Either way, dreams carried weight. And then there were the nightmares, the kind that didn't just frighten but lingered. The medieval mind had little patience for vague psychological explanations. Nightmares were caused by demons sitting on your chest, known as incubi or succubi. They were said to creep in through open windows or cracks in the wall, perch on sleepers, and feed off their breath or, more scandalously, their bodies. These stories were taken so seriously that priests developed prayers and charms specifically to ward off night demons. Ironically, sleeping on your back, what we now know increases sleep paralysis, was considered an open invitation to evil spirits. So if you ever wonder why people in medieval illustrations are sleeping so stiffly on their sides, that's why. In villages, local folklore gave these dreams a more personal spin. A nightmare wasn't just a demon, it might be caused by a witch, or by someone you'd offended. The logic went like this: if you insulted your neighbor and then dreamed of choking or suffocating, clearly she had sent her spirit to torment you at night. To fix it, you could confront her, or better yet, sprinkle blessed salt on your bed. Some households even placed iron scissors under their pillow to cut through evil influences. Though, to be honest, sleeping on scissors sounds like a solution with its own problems. Dreams also had curious gender politics. Men's dreams were thought to be more rational, visions from God, heroic symbols, moral parables. Women's dreams, however, were often dismissed as temptations or hysteria. A nun dreaming of angels was blessed. A peasant woman dreaming of anything too vivid was probably under diabolical influence. This double standard was so strong that when women reported prophetic dreams, the church often reacted with suspicion. Joan of Arc, for instance, claimed to hear divine voices in her sleep. Those dreams helped her lead armies, but also helped get her burned. Still, despite all the warnings, people couldn't resist looking for meaning in dreams. The poor interpreted them through superstition, the rich through scholars, and everyone through whatever bias suited them best. If you dreamed you'd inherit land, it was fate. If you dreamed of falling, it was the devil's test. Conveniently, every dream meant something, but only if interpreted by the right person. That gave certain priests and healers immense influence. They could analyze your dream, tell you what it meant, and prescribe prayers or rituals to fix it. Dream interpretation was a spiritual economy all its own. Even medical theory played a role. Physicians, those same men who believed leeches were a cure-all, argued that dreams reflected the state of your bodily humors. Too much black bile. Expect gloomy dreams. Too much phlegm. Probably wet and confusing dreams. Too much blood. Fiery, lustful dreams. The ideal dreamer, they said, was someone perfectly balanced in body and soul, though, judging by medieval diets, very few people qualified. Let's drift now into how dreams could shape real historical events. One of the strangest examples comes from England, where King Henry I reportedly dreamed of a great wave swallowing his kingdom. The next day, his son drowned at sea. Naturally, people said the dream had foretold it. No one stopped to consider that ships in the 12th century weren't exactly reliable. Similarly, in France, King Charles VI once dreamed of being attacked by his own men, and later, during a fit of madness, he did attack them. The court saw it as prophecy fulfilled, though historians today might lean more toward untreated psychosis. Dreams even influenced architecture. Many churches featured carved, sleeping saints on their tombs, depicted as if resting peacefully, symbolizing divine dreams. In other cases, tombstones warned against restless sleep, because the dead, too, could dream. Medieval people imagined the afterlife as a kind of eternal slumber, filled with visions either blissful or tormenting. Sleep wasn't just rest, it was rehearsal for death. But not all dreams were dark. Some were simply strange. There's a delightful 12th century letter from an English monk who writes that he dreamt of chasing a giant cheese wheel through a meadow. He woke up confused, confessed it to his abbot, and was told to fast for 3 days. Apparently, even dreaming about dairy could be suspicious if you were too enthusiastic. Another scholar reported dreaming of angels lecturing him in Latin grammar, proof, he said, that divine beings had excellent education standards. Dreams could also be used to justify love. Troubadours and poets often wrote that their romantic visions were divinely inspired. A knight dreaming of his lady was a noble soul touched by grace, not a man with a vivid imagination. Poetic, yes, but also convenient. After all, it's easier to explain a forbidden crush when you can say, God showed her to me in a dream. Interestingly, dream sharing was a social ritual. In the morning, people often told their dreams over breakfast or prayer. It was a way of connecting, of confessing, and sometimes of bragging. If you dreamt of heaven, everyone wanted to know what it looked like. If you dreamt of hell, people assumed you'd done something questionable. In noble courts, it became a kind of competition. Who had the most dramatic or spiritual vision last night? Imagine a medieval version of people comparing Netflix shows, only the show was your subconscious. As the centuries drifted forward, the Renaissance softened the tone. Dreams were still mysterious, but thinkers like Leonardo da Vinci and Marsilio Ficino started to suggest that they might come from within, not without. The devil, perhaps, wasn't always responsible. Sometimes, they said, dreams revealed hidden truths about the dreamer. It was an early, slightly paranoid version of psychology. Of course, this didn't stop people from blaming witches or demons when things got too strange, but it was progress of a sort. There's something oddly poetic about it all. Medieval people lived in a world that went dark every night. No electricity, no clocks glowing softly in the corner, just firelight and imagination. Dreams filled that darkness with meaning. Even their fears had stories. When they dreamed, they weren't escaping the world but expanding it. And in a time when so much was uncertain, war, famine, plague, it's easy to understand why they needed those meanings to hold on to something. So, as you're lying there, maybe already drifting toward your own dreams, think of those medieval sleepers, huddled in cold stone rooms, clutching relics, muttering prayers to keep away the night spirits. Their dreams might have terrified them, but they also gave them comfort, connection, even purpose. In a way, we haven't changed much. We still wake up trying to make sense of the strange stories our minds invent in the dark. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had a dream so vivid you thought it meant something? Maybe a medieval monk would have a few things to say about that. Now, let's drift onward to the next quiet mystery of the medieval night. What happened when people didn't sleep at all? Hey everyone, welcome back. If you've been following along, you'll remember that medieval people had a lot to worry about in their sleep: demons, dreams, and the occasional cheese-related vision. But tonight, let's wander into something even more quietly tragic: those who couldn't sleep at all. Because while we modern souls have our coffee addictions and blue light, the sleepless of the Middle Ages had something far more sinister to blame: sin, spirits, and their own guilty consciences. So, get comfortable, breathe out, and imagine it's the year 1320. You're lying in a narrow bed stuffed with straw and itchy wool, listening to the distant howling of a dog somewhere outside the walls. The fire has gone out, and the night stretches endlessly. Sleep doesn't come. And in a world that believes everything has a reason, the question you ask yourself is not, why am I anxious? But, which saint have I offended? Insomnia wasn't just a nuisance, it was spiritual. In medieval medical and religious thinking, sleep was both a gift and a moral barometer. The righteous slept easily, the wicked did not. If you were tossing and turning, it might not be the cold air or fleas, but the weight of sin pressing on your soul. Some chroniclers even described sleeplessness as a punishment sent from God to the restless in heart, which is a poetic way of saying, you must have done something wrong. Medieval medicine had its own theories, of course. Doctors blamed humoral imbalance, too much heat in the liver, too much melancholy in the brain, too much blood rushing to the head. One 14th-century physician wrote that insomniacs should cool their bodies with lettuce, vinegar, and abstinence from heavy meats. Lettuce was, oddly, considered mildly sedative. If you were rich enough, your doctor might even prescribe sleep-inducing herbs, poppy, henbane, or mandrake, though these tended to cause either hallucinations or death, depending on the dosage. The line between remedy and final rest was thin. The Church offered its own cures, of course: prayer, confession, and, if necessary, exorcism. Because sleeplessness could also mean spiritual disturbance. There are records of monks who stayed awake for days, not from insomnia, but from what they believed were demonic attacks. They would pray through the night, muttering psalms, sprinkling holy water, and occasionally shouting at the shadows. Their fellow brothers, ever supportive, would document these incidents in the monastery chronicle and add helpful notes like, "He was of a nervous temperament." Let's drift for a moment to the image of those monasteries at night: rows of stone cells, candles burning low, and one poor monk pacing back and forth because he can't stop thinking about whether he miscopied a line in yesterday's scripture. The silence was immense. Time stretched. You could hear your heartbeat echo. And if you were already a bit on edge, it wasn't hard to believe that something unseen was in the room with you. For lay people, sleeplessness carried its own stigma. A peasant who couldn't sleep might tell the village priest, who would recommend spiritual cleansing, fasting, confession, and a night spent praying at the church altar. The idea was that a clean conscience led to a quiet mind. Ironically, it's hard to rest when you're kneeling on cold stone all night, but at least you'd earn points for effort. And then there were those who simply gave up on sleep altogether, the holy insomniacs. Certain mystics and ascetics believed that sleep was a weakness of the flesh, and to conquer it was to draw closer to God. One monk, named Simeon Stylites, famously lived atop a pillar for decades and claimed to sleep only a few minutes a night, propped against a rope. Others stayed awake for long vigils, reciting prayers or flagellating themselves to stay alert. They believed that the devil attacked most fiercely in the moments before sleep, so the less you slept, the safer your soul. Which, to be fair, is one way to handle anxiety. This extreme avoidance of sleep became something of a trend in holy circles. Manuals for nuns and monks praised the blessed sleepless, those who resisted the temptation of rest. Sleep was compared to death. Pleasant, yes, but potentially sinful if indulged too much. A lazy monk was called a snorer of the Lord. Some monasteries even enforced communal wake-up periods during the night, known as matins, where the brothers would rise in the darkness to chant. It wasn't optional. Nothing like being forced awake at 2 a.m. for singing practice to build character. But outside the cloisters, sleeplessness could drive people to desperate measures. Folk healers offered remedies that sound more like spells than medicine. One 15th-century English charm recommended placing a piece of blessed bread under your pillow while reciting, "In the name of Christ I lay me down, and no unholy thing shall trouble my crown." Another said to rub your temples with owl fat mixed with wine, though it's unclear whether this induced sleep or simply smelled bad enough to clear the room. Sometimes, sleeplessness was blamed on witches. If you couldn't sleep, and your neighbor looked at you funny last week, it was clear who the culprit was. Night hags, as they were called, were believed to sneak into homes in spirit form and sit on sleepers' chests, preventing rest. You could protect yourself by hanging sprigs of rosemary or St. John's wort above the bed. Or by sleeping with your shoes on. Apparently, the devil disliked proper footwear. Among the nobility, sleeplessness carried a more refined interpretation: melancholy. The medieval version of depression, melancholy was considered the curse of the intelligent and sensitive. Poets, scholars, and kings all suffered from it. They described lying awake for hours, tormented by thoughts of mortality, lost love, or the burden of rule. The 14th-century French king Charles VI reportedly stayed awake for days, convinced he was made of glass and might shatter if he moved too quickly. Physicians prescribed soothing music, aromatic herbs, and pleasant conversation, which was probably code for, "Please stop worrying, Your Majesty." Some nobles took their sleeplessness as a mark of superiority. The common man might sleep like a beast, they reasoned, but a mind filled with divine or political matters could not rest easily. Chronic insomnia became almost fashionable, proof that you were important enough to be burdened by thought. It's not far from the modern executive bragging about only needing 4 hours of sleep. Humans haven't changed much. Meanwhile, the average person had more practical reasons to stay awake. Night watchmen, shepherds, millers, they worked in shifts, taking turns sleeping in short bursts. Artificial light was limited, so the night belonged to the patient. People often divided sleep into 2 segments, a first sleep and a second sleep, with an hour or 2 of wakefulness in between. During that time, they prayed, talked quietly, or simply stared at the dark. For insomniacs, this middle-of-the-night wakefulness could stretch into something endless. They'd whisper to each other through the gloom, trading fears like bedtime stories. Physicians eventually began to take sleeplessness seriously as a medical condition. In the 15th century, one doctor wrote, "Those who cannot sleep are consumed by inward heat and wandering thoughts." His treatment involved bathing in warm water with herbs, then drinking a syrup made from lettuce and vinegar. That might sound unpleasant, but it was better than the alternative, bloodletting, which remained the go-to treatment for just about everything. In some regions, people turned sleepless nights into community rituals. If a child or loved one was ill, families would keep vigil through the night, lighting candles and reading psalms. They believed that staying awake showed devotion and kept evil spirits from entering the room. These vigils were solemn but strangely comforting, Everyone gathered in quiet purpose, waiting together for dawn. Even the saints weren't spared from sleeplessness. Saint Catherine of Siena claimed she barely slept for years, sustained only by divine energy. She called sleep the enemy of the soul's longing. Her followers believed her wakefulness was proof of sanctity. From another angle, it sounds like exhaustion. But in a world that prized endurance over comfort, the line between miracle and breakdown was thin. There were practical dangers, too. Candlelight was a fragile friend. Many nighttime accidents came from sleepless people trying to move about, tripping over chamber pots, setting curtains on fire, or mistaking the family cat for a demon. The darkness of a medieval home was total. No street lamps, no glow from electronics, just black silence. And if you were awake when everyone else slept, that silence could feel like a presence in itself. Insomnia also carried social consequences. Persistent sleeplessness could mark someone as cursed or possessed. A villager who complained too often might be shunned, lest their affliction spread. After all, if you didn't sleep, you probably had restless spirits hovering nearby. Sleep was communal safety. To lose it was to step outside of normal life. Let's drift toward a softer image now, those who simply made peace with sleeplessness. Many medieval people accepted it as part of life. Nights were long, and the world was unpredictable. They used the extra hours to pray, to think, or to tell stories. In some ways, sleeplessness gave them a strange kind of intimacy with the night. The quiet hours between dreams were a time to face the self, stripped of daylight distractions. In literature, sleeplessness became a metaphor. Lovers lay awake, consumed by longing. Warriors stayed vigilant before battle. Even Christ's sleepless night in Gethsemane became a moral model, wakefulness as devotion, the refusal to rest while others slept. To be awake in the dark meant to be spiritually alert, aware of the mysteries unfolding beyond sight. By the late medieval period, sleeplessness was no longer seen purely as punishment. It became a condition to manage, not to fear. Physicians began recommending structured bedtimes, lighter meals, and warm drinks before bed. Essentially, they rediscovered the basics of sleep hygiene, centuries before we gave it a name. They even encouraged listening to music or reading psalms to calm the mind, which makes medieval bedtime sound surprisingly modern. Still, for many, the night remained a battle. Between guilt and grace. Between exhaustion and fear. Between silence and the whisper that maybe, just maybe, something was watching. So if you've ever lain awake staring at the ceiling, you have good company. The medieval world was full of sleepless souls, pacing the cold floors of monasteries, whispering prayers in tiny huts, or staring at candlelight that flickered like a pulse. They didn't count sheep, they counted sins, hopes, and the hours until dawn. And when dawn finally came, it was salvation. The bells would ring, the world would reawaken, and the sleepless could finally rest, not because they slept, but because the dark was over. Tell me in the comments, if you lived in those times, would you rather spend a sleepless night in a monastery, or in a village full of whispering ghosts? Now, let's drift forward to something lighter, but no less strange, the nighttime remedies people invented to keep the darkness at bay. So here we are, drifting softly toward the end of our long and drowsy walk through medieval nights. The candles are almost melted down to little puddles of wax, the peasants have long since stopped their prayers, and the castles have gone quiet except for the occasional clank of a guard's halberd against a stone. It's the final stretch, the last breath before dawn. And fittingly, this is where we look at what it meant to sleep in a world before comfort was ever a concept. In our age, we debate the firmness of mattresses or the noise of the neighbor's TV. They debated demons, bed lice, and whether their souls might be dragged from their bodies by witches in the night. Simpler times, in a way. Just a touch more fatalistic. In many parts of Europe, the church bells marked the beginning and end of sleep as though people were livestock. Monks in monasteries woke 3 or 4 times a night to chant and pray. They believed that true devotion meant interrupting rest, that God's ear was most open when mortals were least awake. Imagine that for a moment, drifting off just long enough to start dreaming, only to be shaken awake by a bell summoning you to sing in the dark. It's a miracle anyone made it through the century without a severe case of sleep deprivation. And yet, they called it peace. There's a kind of poetry in that, if you squint at it through exhaustion. Common folk, of course, didn't have much choice in their sleep patterns either. Their days were dictated by light, their nights by cold. A peasant in 13th century England might crawl under a scratchy wool blanket with 3 other family members, a pile of hay underneath, and a goat lingering nearby for warmth. If you're picturing a cozy pastoral scene, adjust your expectations. The smell alone could knock you straight into a religious vision. But warmth was warmth, and they took it where they could find it. People learned to share body heat with animals not because it was cute, but because it was survival. And because of course they did. This was an age before chimneys, when smoke filled the rafters and dreams probably came tinted gray. Somewhere in that smoky half-sleep, beliefs took root. The medieval world was convinced that the night was not safe for the soul. Sleeping was a vulnerable act, both physically and spiritually. That's why they hung iron above beds, or tucked bits of bread in their pockets, small charms to trick spirits into leaving them alone. Dreaming, too, was dangerous. Dreams were seen as messages from God, or, more often, from something less polite. A bad dream might mean the devil had found your window open. A good one might be a test of humility. Either way, no one was getting much rest. But not all nocturnal adventures were miserable. In the courts of Europe, the night had its own brand of entertainment. Aristocrats would host bedchamber gatherings, something between a modern pajama party and a council meeting. Ladies embroidered by candlelight, gentlemen discussed politics, musicians played soft tunes on lutes. Sleep came later, often interrupted by poetry or scandal. In some royal courts, beds were social objects, not private sanctuaries. A king's bed was a political stage. Being invited to sit on it, or even near it, was an honor. Some nobles even dined in bed, propped up by mountains of embroidered pillows, because standing up for dinner was apparently too common. The French royal court elevated this habit into performance art. Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, staged his waking and sleeping like grand ceremonies. Courtiers would gather to watch him get undressed, then again in the morning to watch him put his clothes back on. Nothing says divine monarchy like having an audience for your bedtime routine. The ritual was called the coucher, and hundreds of nobles jostled for the privilege of handing the king his nightshirt. A truly dazzling example of human priorities. If you ever feel self-conscious about wearing old pajamas, remember, entire titles and fortunes once hinged on who got to pass a royal slipper. Elsewhere in Europe, the obsession with proper sleeping posture reached near moral levels. Sleeping flat was suspicious, it resembled death. So, most slept propped up, half-sitting, as though prepared to be judged at any moment. People believed the body's humors could pool in the wrong places during sleep, leading to illness or worse. And so, they built their beds high and angled, like little thrones of fatigue. Even pillows were tools of spiritual hygiene. To rest too low was to tempt death. To rest too high was to risk arrogance. The sweet spot, as usual, was both uncomfortable and righteous. Of course, the church had opinions too. It always did. Monks wrote treatises warning against sleeping too much, calling it sloth, one of the 7 deadly sins. Sleep, they said, dulled the soul. And so, good Christians were told to rise early, sleep lightly, and pray often. One chronicler even recorded that the devil attacked in dreams precisely because people let their guard down. Imagine being so afraid of relaxation that you moralize against it. On the other hand, maybe that explains a few modern work habits. In cities, sleep took on a different rhythm entirely. Medieval urban life never really went quiet. Bakers worked through the night, watchmen patrolled the streets, and drunks sang questionable songs under windows. Many households took turns sleeping, half on guard, half dreaming. Night watchmen carried lanterns and whistles, warning of fires or thieves. They also doubled as unofficial alarm clocks, shouting the hour into the darkness. You'd be drifting peacefully when suddenly, 2 of the clock, and all's well. Right under your window. A sweet lullaby, truly. It's a wonder people didn't just sleep in the fields. But what's perhaps most fascinating is that they didn't even sleep the way we do. Historians now believe medieval people followed what's called segmented sleep, 2 separate blocks of rest with a waking period in between. You'd go to bed soon after dark, sleep for 4 hours, then wake around midnight. This was called the first sleep. People used that middle time to pray, make love, stoke the fire, even visit neighbors. Then they'd settle in for second sleep until dawn. It was ordinary, not insomnia, not a problem. Just life. The night wasn't an interruption but a rhythm, divided neatly by dreams. That brief waking period became a kind of twilight of consciousness. Diaries mention it as a quiet, reflective time. No rush, no noise, just a candle and your thoughts. In a way, it sounds enviably peaceful. Today, if we wake up at 2 a.m., we panic, scroll our phones, and wonder what's wrong with us. They simply rolled over and waited for sleep to return. Maybe they understood something we've forgotten. That rest isn't just unconsciousness, it's permission to be still. And maybe that's why we tell these sleepy stories at all. As dawn crept over those medieval roofs, life stirred back to motion. Peasants trudged out to fields. Nobles called for their servants. Monks rang the bells again. And every soul, rich or poor, carried some trace of the night with them, a dream, a worry, a warmth shared under rough blankets. They didn't sleep well, by our standards, but they dreamed richly. Theirs was a world lit by flickering flames and shaped by superstition, yet somehow it carried a quiet understanding of rest that our age often loses. And so, as our own night winds down, it's oddly comforting to think that across centuries, everyone has wrestled with the same fragile need for rest. The peasants on straw beds, the kings in gilded chambers, the monks in cold cells, all trying to find a little peace between dusk and dawn. Maybe, in that sense, we're not so different. We too make our rituals, turning off phones, setting alarms, choosing which side of the bed feels right. And tomorrow, like them, we'll wake and start again, pretending we've mastered the art of sleep. So let's end here, gently. The medieval world fades back into shadow, the candles gutter out, and the night returns to silence. You can close your eyes now, knowing that people have been doing exactly this for 1,000 years, trying, failing, and trying again to rest. If you've enjoyed this quiet journey, leave a soft comment below. Tell me, what do you think your first sleep dreams would have been about? Something peaceful, I hope. Maybe a castle, maybe a goat. Either way, it's yours to keep. Thank you for wandering through the centuries with me tonight. If you'd like to drift through more sleepy corners of history, where the past hums softly and nothing too urgent ever happens, you can like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs a little calm. Until next time, may your bed be warm, your dreams harmless, and your night blessedly uneventful. Good night, traveler. Sleep well.